All right. So, fair warning out of the gate. Okay. This is our topic for today. Now, I already know some of y'all, this conversation is going to get out of hand. Okay. Some of y'all like to be on 10. All right. And I'm going to allow you to be on 10 in this conversation. And there's a lot of reasons why I want to have this. And I've been really trying to stay out of the liturgical wars, you guys. I've been really trying not to get myself involved in this infighting and mess. But many of you know that I have a special place in my heart for the TLM, the traditional Latin Mass. And I have a special place in my heart for the Novus Ordo as well, because I attend both Masses. And we talked about how to attend the Novus Ordo reverently here on the channel. So make sure that you go ahead and check out that video. But today, I want to talk about which one should you attend. Does it matter? And just kind of get to the heart of what's going on and why this conversation is happening, because we have so many people who are brand new to the faith, who have stepped away for a long while, and they're coming back and they're trying to figure out what they need for themselves spiritually. And they're hearing about this war going on between people who want the traditional Latin Mass and the Novus Ordo, and why one is better than the other, and XYZ, and y'all are just confused. So I have an article that I do want to go over with you that was released earlier this month from the New Yorker, which gives a nice little synopsis of what's going on and some of the controversy. And then I want to kind of share with you my thoughts on the liturgical wars. And hopefully you walk away from this video with a little bit more of an idea of where you might want to end up when it comes to your worship. Now, I want to start off the bat by saying that I think there is a place for both forms of the Mass in our worship, in our Catholic liturgy. They are both valid forms. And you got some people are saying that the Novus Ordo is invalid and it's not as good as the TLM. And I think that's a very dangerous game that we play when we say these things, because as I mentioned in how to attend the Novus Ordo reverently, not everyone has access to the TLM. And it really leaves for me a sense of elitist in the feeling towards people who are adherent and orthodox in faith, and you like the traditionalism and you like TLM. It kind of feels elitist to me when you shun the other forms of the Mass and make it seem like it's not valid or it's not worthy for us as Catholics to attend. And we can't do that. But we can absolutely talk about the differences. We can talk about why we feel one is better than the other, and why the Vatican, why Pope Francis is trying to tamp down on this. So that way more Catholics can actually understand what we're talking about, and they can make their own decisions as to what they want when it comes to where they worship. And let's keep in mind that because they're closing down on all of the TLM parishes around the United States in particular, a lot of people don't have access to this Mass. Here's an interesting thing that recently happened. So I was talking to a friend of mine just the other day, and they were telling me we were having a small heated discussion about Catholicism, and they're not very supportive of Catholicism, and they see themselves as a non-denominational Christian. So you know me. Listen, I was fired up. Okay, I was spirited in a mug, but I apologize for being so spirited. But one of the things that this person said to me that really stuck, and that's going to go ahead and flow into this conversation, is that they were dating someone. They had a significant other who was Catholic, and they attended a church back in New York City, and they went with their significant other for a good 2 or 3 years to a Catholic church. Now, I don't know if it was every week or how often it was, but it was often enough that they were dating this person, and obviously this person probably took their faith seriously to a degree, and so they were experiencing the Mass. And what this person, my friend, said to me was that they don't understand how we can go into a building and worship a man. We're worshiping the priest. We're not there worshiping Christ. We're there focused on the church service, and everything is about praying to a human being. And that floored me, because for us as Catholics, we know that's not what we do. But to see that some of the greatest criticisms that people who are into the TLM have about the Novus Ordo is this very thing, that people have lost a sense of the spiritual, people have lost a sense of the direction of the liturgy and the Mass to Christ, and the worship being about God. This person was also very erroneous in saying that scripture is not read in the Catholic Mass, but we know as Catholics, and I've explained that here on my channel, that it is indeed talked about and that it is indeed read. It is indeed studied. Literally every single word of our Mass comes straight out of the Bible. But you wouldn't know that. You wouldn't know that unless you know that. And that is a problem that a lot of folks have with the new Mass, is that when the Vatican II instilled these changes, it took the sanctity out of it. It took the sacred mystery out of it. It took the focus off of Jesus Christ and put it onto the priest, just like my friend had pointed out in their interpretation. So I have an article here that we're going to go ahead and read right now from the New Yorker. And I want to hear you guys' thoughts and opinions. Do you think one is better than the other? And I hate that question. I hate that question because, again, I feel like it's elitist. And some of you will say, yes, the TLM is far better. Okay, we already know what you're going to say. Okay. Some of you might say the Novus Ordo is better. But what I want to know is if you go to one Mass or the other, why? That is what I want to see in the comments. I want to hear your why. Why do you prefer to attend the TLM? Why do you prefer the Novus Ordo? Let's have that conversation in the comments. And in the meantime, let's go ahead and bring up this article from the New Yorker. And I thought that this was actually a pretty good article, even though it's a New Yorker and we know that it's more like, I guess you can say, I guess they're kind of down the middle, but they're a little bit more on the left leaning, but this was actually not a bad article explaining what's going on. Let's get into it, okay? So what's behind the fight between Pope Francis and the Latin Mass movement? The discord has become a stand-in for conflicts over the decline in Catholics' participation in Mass, over the progressive orientation of Francis's pontificate, and over Vatican II itself. And this was released on April 9th of this year, and that's just about 3 weeks ago. So this is fairly new. This is fairly new. Beautiful picture over here. Okay. All right, let's get into it. On January 15, 2022, the Catholic Archbishop of San Francisco, Salvatore Cordileone, celebrated Mass at St. Patrick's Old Cathedral at Mott and Prince Streets in Manhattan. If you have not been to St. Patrick's Old Cathedral in New York, you guys have to see it. It's absolutely beautiful. The cathedral, erected in 1815, is the predecessor to the present cathedral on Fifth Avenue. I graduated. I have my high school graduation at St. Patrick's Cathedral on Fifth Avenue, by the way. And it puts in mind the Catholicism of the 19th and early 20th centuries when Irish, German, Italian, and Polish immigrants settled in great numbers in New York City. I've shared with you guys, I am a Catholic out of New York. I cannot stress this enough. Growing up as a Catholic in New York, I was very much in an Irish, Italian, and some Polish community when it came to my faith and parish. So that was an interesting upbringing I had there. The Mass itself, also called Catholic History to Mind. It was a Mass for the Americas, a work for choir and orchestra commissioned by Archbishop Cordileone and incorporating texts in English, Spanish, Latin, and Nahuatl, the indigenous language spoken by Juan Diego, whose visions of the Virgin Mary in Guadalupe in 1531 figure into the foundation story of Catholicism in Mexico. Cordileone, clean-shaven, wearing a white cassock edged with lace, offered the Eucharistic prayers in Latin while facing away from the congregation as priests did prior to the Second Vatican Council, which concluded in 1965. Let me just take a pause right there to let you guys know of the gravity of what he did. If you're someone who is unfamiliar with Catholicism, particularly Catholicism in New York City in general, and Cordileone. Okay, so this man is based. He is based in a mug. Okay, Cordileone is the bishop, the Archbishop of San Francisco, who told Nancy Pelosi that she cannot receive, she was pretty much excommunicated, I guess, in her parish. Like, she could not receive the Eucharist in her parish at all, period. But she had, that's a whole thing. She had went to the Vatican and got the Holy Eucharist from the Pope. Like, just complete defiance. This woman, just crazy. But anyway, I'm not going to get into that. So he put his foot down because she stood up for abortion, all right? He's known, and they're going to get into this in a minute, he's known as being a very traditional Latin Mass supporter. He likes the old rite, and he stands up and fights for it. And to do that in New York City, New York is a very progressive town, as we know. And growing up in that city, very Novus Ordo parishes. I mean, they're very reverent. I had a great parish myself, but I don't know how they are now. Years later, I haven't been to New York in like 15 years as far as living is concerned. So the fact that he did this Mass at St. Patrick's Old Cathedral, a landmark in Catholicism in New York City, a landmark period, facing away from the congregation, facing the altar, saying the prayers in Latin, that was a sign of his baseness and his defiance. So go ahead, boy. Oh, Lord. I told you it's going to get dramatic over here. All right, let's go ahead and continue. It's like, let's go on. Let's go on. In doing so, he took a stand in an unlikely pair of controversies. By facing the altar, he affirmed the prerogatives of a movement of Catholics devoted to the Latin Mass, a movement that has met resistance at the Vatican under Pope Francis. Cordileone, who was unvaccinated in 2022 and did not wear a mask, was also defying a COVID-19 city ordinance compelling venues hosting public gatherings to require masks or proof of vaccination. For those that did not know, you were not paying attention, honey, listen, they were locked down in New York City. Like, New York City was one of the most locked down cities in the US when it came to these restrictions. So not only was he like doing what he was doing with the mask, but it's unvaccinated, unmasked, and he was taking a stand, okay, whether you agree with it or not. So let's keep going. Since then, the controversies have hardened into direct conflict. The traditional Latin Mass, long a source of sustenance for Catholics leery of the reforms of the Vatican II, is now a focal point for Catholics who disdain Pope Francis. The death in December of Benedict XVI, the Pope Emeritus, left Catholic traditionalists without a champion in Rome. Benedict's views on the Mass were complex, but his preference for Baroque vestments had made him a figurehead for old school Catholicism. His long efforts to close a breach between the Vatican and the Society of St. Pius X, a cadre of Latin reciting priests whose leaders were excommunicated in 1988, had emboldened the TLM movement, and a directive he issued in 2007 had quickened the movement's spread. Then, in early February, the publication of a leaked report from an FBI branch office declaring that Latin Mass enclaves in Virginia harbored anti-Semites let's do that again, harbored anti-Semites and members of the far-right white nationalist movement led traditionalists to claim that a religion-averse deep state was targeting them, and the Bureau's retraction of the report soon afterwards. And that only sharpened their sense of themselves as persecuted minority. I thought that whole thing that happened, some of you, again, you are very new to the faith. Here on the channel, we talk to converts, new converts to the faith. We talk to reverts coming back into the fold. And we talk to people who've already been, doing your Catholic thing for a long time, right? So for those of you that are kind of new coming back, you're kind of like, what is going on with all this TLM stuff? Like, what is this conflict? This is the conflict. So you guys should know about it because it is an important discussion. When you have someone who sits in the Mass in a Catholic church for 2 to 3 years and they don't understand what's going on and they think that you're worshiping a priest, you're worshiping a man, that is a problem. And a lot of what's going on, and we're going to talk about this later on in the article, a lot of the problems that people have with the Novus Ordo, the new Mass, the only Mass that some of you know, is that it takes that sacred sense out of it, leaving people disconnected from the church in many ways. Now, again, my video, we talked about how to do it reverently. And if you go ahead and you apply the things that I shared with you at the Novus Ordo, it just brings out the fullness of that liturgy, of that Mass, right? But that's not the point, okay? Let's get back into the article, though, and still dig into this controversy because you guys have got to know what's going on. Let's get back into it. Above all, a pair of terse instructions issued by Francis have stirred opposition. In July 2021, the Pope required priests who wish to celebrate the Old Mass to seek permission from their bishops, compelled the bishops to get clearance from the Vatican, which Benedict's directive did not do, and forbade bishops to authorize the founding of Latin Mass groups in individual dioceses, which would serve to build up the movement as an alternative form of weekly worship. So a lot of the controversy and the reasons why people are so upset is that it's like you're having your rights you're having your rights to choose what form of worship you want to go to taken from you. If the Latin Mass is a valid Mass within the Catholic Church, even to this day, if it is offered in a parish, you should have the option to go to it, right? You should have the option to go for it. But instead, they're trying to take them out of the parishes. They're making it harder and harder for it to be celebrated. They're not allowing new priests to learn it. And they are making it so that way they're crippling an entire form of worship that has been around in the Catholic Church for over 500 years. Therein lies the problem. We can have masses in every other language except for the original language of the church. I think that makes sense, right? So that's some of the controversy that's going on there. Let's go ahead and continue. Let's continue here. In February, he reiterated that position. The instructions were meant to tamp down the TLM movement lest it deepen, as Francis put it, the peril of division in the church. What they're afraid of is the fact that these TLM parishes, these TLM masses, are booming with young people. That is the biggest threat. Because if your church ain't crying, honey, your church is dying. If your church ain't got no babies in it and families, that parish is gonna go boo boo, go away. The TLM is teeming with younger people, millennials with their families, zennials with a Z, right? And so this is a threat because this is coming up. This is the future of the church. This is the future, and they're trying to push this aside. They don't want it. That's where a lot of this other controversy is coming from. And when you think about what is right for you, what do you want to support? These are the things that are at the heart of the matter. And so let's go ahead and get back into this. I'm being so dramatic. I know I'm being dramatic, but listen, we got to talk about this, right? But by requiring a bishop's permission, they gave fresh authority to the bishops who cherished the TLM, such as Cordileone and Michael F. Burbridge in Arlington, Virginia, and promoted Latin Mass enthusiasts to decry a Vatican crackdown on true believers. They also undermine the image of Francis as a pastoral pope who urges Catholics to go to the margins and uses a personal touch to bridge the gap between doctrine and practice. And they drew the expressly forward-looking pope deeper into a sustained conflict about the status of the Catholic past. On the surface, it's hard to see what all the fuss is all about. Latin Mass adherents are a tiny minority of practicing Catholics, and most church traditionalists, bishops, priests, and lay people alike are content to take part in masses offered in the language they speak in everyday life. Now it goes to ask, sure, they probably are content because that's all they know for many parishioners and lay people. And that there probably are more priests, bishops, and more who would love to celebrate the Latin Mass, but it's not offered in their parish or diocese at all. So how can you say that people are truly content when they don't even know it's out there and exists, right? I think that's kind of a straw man argument right there. In the Archdiocese of New York, Mass is offered in more than a dozen languages. But the TLM conflict has become a stand-in for other conflicts over the decline in Catholics' participation in Mass and the quality of the liturgy. Now we're getting into the heart of the matter. Over the outward-facing progressive orientation of Francis's pontificate and over Vatican II itself, which traditionalists see not as a thoroughgoing reform, but as something between a modest course correction and a betrayal of the church's patrimony. For many centuries, especially after the Council of Trent concluded in 1563, the Latin Mass was celebrated according to strict rubrics under the supervision of Rome, was the main thing that all Catholics had in common and a sign of their difference in the eyes of the wider world. That's one of the things that I actually do love about the Latin Mass. is that the TLM is so uniquely Catholic. Like, you can watch a television show or a movie or see something, a picture or something, and know that it is Catholic, that it is ours, that it is sacred, that it is ancient, that it has history, that it has meaning. And everything that we do in it is not just ritualistic. You have some people that say, oh, everything is in Catholicism is ritual, man-made ritual, man-made. It's like, what exactly is man-made ritual? Because everything that we do, particularly in the Latin Mass, which is so beautiful, it's just so reverent, is in Scripture, right? And it's universal, because Catholic, at the end of the day, means universal, right? Universal. So it's a beautiful thing. Let's get back into it. Let's see. During the suppression of Roman Catholicism under Queen Elizabeth I, Jesuits in England celebrated Latin Mass in secret, and some who were caught were hanged, drawn, and quartered. Charles Dickens, in Pictures from Italy, describes arriving in Modena on a Sunday in 1844 and stepping into a dim cathedral where high mass was performing. Feeble tapers were burning. People were kneeling in all directions before all manners of shrines, and officiating priests were crooning the usual chant in the unusual low, dull, drawing, melancholy tone. And then the article goes on to explain other situations that they've seen in art, in books, literature, in what else? In movies, in song, of Latin chants and other things that are symbolic of our Mass, and how these things were symbolic, right? Anna Quinlan wrote in her book, Dominus Vobiscum et cum Spiritu Tuo. She wrote in the Times in 1986 that these are my bona fide words. These are my bona fides, rather. A word, a phrase, a sentence in a language no one speaks anymore. I love when I see the Catholics that know a little Latin and we greet each other in Latin. That's fantastic. It's like, yeah, I know how to speak an old ancient language that's completely useless to you, but it means everything to me. By then, the Latin Mass was 20 years out of use. This was back in the 1980s. The vast renewal of Catholic life and practice brought about through the Second Vatican Council began with the reform of the liturgy, building on several decades of efforts inspired by historical research or trends in the arts, moving the altar away from the far wall, turning the priest to face the people, shifting the proceedings from Latin to the vernacular, a Latinate word for the everyday language of a people or region, enjoining people to recite the prayers themselves rather than just listen to the priest murmur Latin words they barely understood. All of these reforms were meant to elicit a full and active participation in the liturgy. The new approach began to be instilled in 1965. Plenty of people complained. A 1969 papal document with the Latin title Novus Ordo reaffirmed the changes. A sense of grievance became a sense of loss, which Gary Willis described in his book Bare Ruined Choirs, 1972. Even the Mass, the central and most stable shared act of the Church, had become unrecognizable to many, a thing of guitars instead of the organ, of English instead of Latin, of youth culture fads instead of ancient rites. The essayist Richard Rodriguez, a decade later, observed, "No longer is the congregation moved to a contemplation of the timeless. Rather, it is the idiomatic one hears. One's focus is upon this place, this time, the moment, now." Remember what I told you about what my friend had felt in the presence of going to Catholic masses for 2 to 3 years. Nothing. And I wonder, to myself, man, would this person feel the same way if I sat and talked about and clarified what our Mass was about? If I gave them a deeper understanding and maybe even let them come with me to a Latin Mass, would they see and feel something that's just completely different. And I really think they would, because I know that I do as someone who practices this faith. And it's transformative. And these are the things that people are arguing about. So those of you who are here to learn and wonder why, this is what's at the heart of the matter. So many of you don't know because you haven't experienced it yet. Some of us grew up with this stuff or even had little pieces of it in our Novus Ordo parishes as we were going up through the 80s, sometime through the 90s. By the 2000s, it was all gone, right? But it's just an important conversation when it comes down to how you wish to worship and what liturgy speaks to your heart. Let's go ahead and continue with the article. This article is really good, right? I really want to hear what you guys have to say. Post your thoughts down below in the comments. We're almost done. You have the new center held. The folk mass trend subsided. Tasteful, historical, evocative vernacular masses emerged. Some flecked with Latin here and there. Pope John Paul II, who was deeply traditional in matters of doctrine and morality, led open-air masses that were profoundly non-traditional, huge crowds, people waving banners and snapping photos, the Pope sporting regional garb, a headdress in Mexico, a staff, and a shield in Kenya. Some folks have a lot of problems with that. And reading from scripts in local languages. 2 generations of Catholics came of age with no memory of the old ways. I can say that I understand that because Pope John Paul II, he is, I respect him so much for his work. Theology of the body and all that stuff has been very pivotal for me. But my generation, that was the only Pope we knew. He was Pope for a long time. He's a Pope that we grew up with. He was like a rock star. For those of you who don't remember me, you weren't born yet or whatever, JP2 was a rock star, all right? And I guess what they're kind of saying is that what he also solidified was this like celebration of the Mass in a way that was completely different than anything the church knew before then, right? And so many folks now don't have any idea of the differences. And when you experience the difference, it is huge. Let's get back into this. All right, let's see. Where are we? I keep getting lost here because I keep talking. That's why. The ads in the Saturday Times announcing traditional Latin masses at a chapel in Long Island seemed like postings of a secret society. In a way, they were, but the TLM movement grew and came in from the cold, stimulated by forces akin to those which had led to the doing away of it in the first place. Some Catholics found the no longer new vernacular Mass rote and dispiriting. When I talked about how to reverently celebrate the Novus Ordo Mass, this is one of the things that I really push for you guys to do. Don't just recite the prayers as though you just have it in memory. Too many people do that. You got to get to the spirit and the heart of the words and what you're saying and understand and feel it. And it's so easy to lose that. And that's one thing that a lot of folks have a problem with. The 35-year run of John Paul and Benedict tilted the clergy rightward, and many of the most ardent Catholics in those years were the most traditional ones who sought out the Latin Mass for the qualities celebrated in literature, music, and art, as well as in the vast corpus of Catholic thought prior to 1965. You are doing away with a lot of history when you do away with the Latin Mass, with the Latin celebration, the Latin language. You're doing away with the entire history of the church. It's crazy, right? All right, let's continue. It was no surprise that many such people would be conservative politically, or that they would see the government as hostile to religion, a tendency heightened during the pandemic when New York and other states imposed stricter restrictions on gatherings at churches than in supermarkets or restaurants. What were we supposed to think, right? Nor was it a surprise that the Archbishop most prominent in the effort for liturgical restoration, Cordileone, was the one who tangled most visibly with a progressive Catholic politician, telling Nancy Pelosi, here we go, whose congressional district includes San Francisco, that he would withhold communion from her at any Mass where he was presiding because of her support for legal abortion. 6 months after celebrating the Mass of the Americas in Manhattan, Cordileone led a simplified parish version at the Meritage Resort and Spa in California's Napa Valley. During the summer conference of the Napa Institute, a deep-pocketed traditionalist advocacy group that has sponsored and funded a range of TLM initiatives alongside its own efforts to build Catholic support for an unregulated free market economy and to reshape the Supreme Court along traditionalist Catholic lines. So the rest of this article is just going into some political stuff, right? And I kind of don't want to get into that in this conversation, but it's kind of the end of it anyway. But there is the article that kind of, I thought, very nicely laid out what the big deal is about. So those of you that don't know, that is it. Now, I'm going to go on with my thoughts. Let's wrap it up with my thoughts. I think that the most important thing for each one of you is that you're just going to Mass. Okay. Like you're just going to Mass. You're showing up, you're going to Mass, but you're not just showing up. You're showing up in the fullness of the worship of the Lord, because at the end of the day, whether it is a TLM or if it's a Novus Ordo, we are there for Christ. So all of this infighting is actually kind of painful. All of this infighting is actually hard to see because we want to be united. But at the same time, we have to ask questions like, why is church attendance so low within the Catholic Church? Now, let's be fair. Religion is going down everywhere across the world. It is scary. We are likely in the end of days, honey, in the way that the church is getting smaller and smaller. And that's what it predicted in Revelation, right? So we have to ask questions. Why are more and more people stepping away from faith? Why do people not believe in the real presence of Christ in the Holy Eucharist, the central dogma of our faith? Why do they see it as just a symbol? They don't even respect it. What is causing the hemorrhaging of our congregations? How can we bring people back to the fold, back to the sacredness of Christ? That is what is at the heart of the matter. Now, as I said, so many of you do not have access to the TLM. And if you do, if it is near enough for you to check out, I would say to go, try it out and see. See what speaks to your heart. For some of you, it may not. You may love your parish. You may love a more, traditionally celebrated, very reverent Novus Ordo. You might like more of a charismatic Mass. You might like something that feels like you're at a gospel, church. There's some churches out here in LA, Black Catholic churches, that use gospel music in their worship, and these places are packed wall to wall. There's one parish in Santa Monica, California, St. Monica's, which is packed wall to wall with people, and their masses are very progressive, right? And there are other places like the traditional Latin Mass that are held in Novus Ordo parishes, and there's also St. Vitus up here, that's a big TLM parish, that are brimming with people. So when we see that fruit, we can't say that one is better than the other. They just all speak to different people, but at the end of the day, we're still there to worship our Lord. Now, here's the thing. Those of you who may not attend the TLM, you should be standing up for it because it is still a valid Mass. It is still here. It is still a part of what we do. Do not just ignore it and shut it. It's like, oh, it's a traditionalist. Oh my stars, oh my glory. We don't want to, no, stand up for it. Because if they can take this away, what's next? If they can take away the foundation of what our Mass has always been for over 500 years, what is next? The church is under attack, you guys. We see what's going on in Germany. That's coming to a parish near you. And if you're not willing to stand up for Holy Mother Church, stand up for what we believe, stand up for the core values of Catholicism, and stand up for the ability to worship the way that you want, even if you choose to go to one or the other type of Mass, you've got to be able to do that so we can bring some solidarity back to our faith. Now, that is my opinion. But here's the thing, what's yours? I want to hear your thoughts. So make sure that you guys go ahead and you head down to the comments and let me know what you think. Does it matter to you? Does it matter what Mass people go to? Which Mass do you prefer? And that's the question I really want to get at. What Mass do you prefer? What do you feel speaks to your soul? Go ahead and post that down below. Give us the reasons why. If you used to go to one and now you go to the other, tell us why. Because there are people that need to know and need to hear your story. I'm just one person in this game, but you sharing your story, your experiences, that is what's going to make the most positive change for us here in our faith across the world. And I did talk about how to reverently celebrate the Novus Ordo. You want to go ahead and check that out because most of you, that's the only Mass you have available to you. So go ahead and check out this video right over here and watch that and apply it to your worship today. I thank you so much, you guys, for joining, and I will see you on the next one. Bye-bye.